Décolonisation le Vietnam, épisode 14, 1949-1950. Hello and welcome back to our history of French Indochina. Before starting today, let me thank you again for being here, and let me ask you as well to help me grow this podcast. And for that, you can do one, two, or the following three things. First of all, talk about it with your friends and people you think might be interested. Nothing beats word of mouth. Secondly, please subscribe to the podcast whenever you listen to it, be it Spotify or Apple Podcasts, for example. And lastly, leave us a rating or a review on your favorite podcast platform as well. And again, thank you in advance. And now, back to the episode of today. In the previous episode, we covered the birth of the Associated State of Vietnam in 1949. Theoretically, Vietnam was now an independent country, but the reality was obvious for everybody. The Associated States of Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia were just another way of marketing the French protectorate in Indochina. But as we will see today, 1949 was also a crucial year because across the border in China, Mao Zedong won the civil war and brought the Communist Party to power. The consequences of both the communist takeover and the French marketing to the US were massive for our little colonial war. Suddenly, Vietnam became a front line of the Cold War. The great powers were coming to Vietnam, and while the United States and China confronted each other head-on in Korea, they used proxies in Vietnam. On the right corner, the Associated State of Vietnam, chaperoned by France and the US. And on the left corner, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, allied with China and the Soviet Union. Let's start in China and what happened there. Well, it happened that from 1948 to 1949, the communists recorded victory after victory. In 1948, they conquered Manchuria, that's northeastern China. Then, by January 1949, they took control of Beijing and Tianjin. And in 1949, all the remaining major cities fell into their hands, and on October the 1st, Mao Zedong officially proclaimed the People's Republic of China. China and its 600 million inhabitants therefore swung into the communist camp. So when Communist China officially recognized the Ho Chi Minh government on the 18th of January 1950, followed by the Soviet Union on the 30th of January, plus all the Eastern European satellites, well, alarm bells became deafening in Paris and Washington. Why? One, because the French had been taking their time since the Élysée Accords to promulgate the decrees implementing those accords from March 1949. And secondly, in part because of French slowness, the US did not formally recognize the Associated State of Vietnam and were still weighing their options. Well, the proclamation of the People's Republic of China tipped both France and the US over. Chinese and Soviet recognition of the DRV had woken everybody up. The Americans went all in behind France, recognizing Bao Dai's regime and trusting the French to fight the communists. And for that, they had to overcome their reluctance towards colonialism and agree that the French would still be in charge instead of the Bao Dai regime. So on the 7th of February 1950, US Secretary of State Acheson, I hope that's how you pronounce it, well, Dean Acheson announced American official recognition of the Associated State of Vietnam. And let's pause here to understand exactly why was the US getting involved. To start with, let me make one point clear again. In 1949-1950, the Americans were not fooled by the French colonialist intentions, but they reached the conclusion that the best way to counter communism was to support the pursuit of French Indochina. Why? Well, for the Americans, China becoming a red state was not an isolated event. They linked the loss of China, as they said, to many other dangerous developments. In August 1949, for example, the Soviets proceeded to test their first atomic bomb, and the Americans lost the nuclear monopoly. Another example, in 1949, in addition to China and Vietnam, there were communist insurgencies in Malaya, in Burma, and in the Philippines. And I'm not even talking about the tensions between communists and anti-communists in Korea. And the Berlin blockade just ended in May 1949. Therefore, to American eyes, it looked like there was a global communist offensive, and they had to stop that communist momentum by any means necessary. And it is that sense of danger that convinced them that granting total independence to the Vietnamese were just not a good idea. The risk here was to destabilize the centrist government in Paris, and that was the last thing the US needed, a shaky ally on the European front. The thinking went something like this. If they forced Paris to give total independence to Bao Dai, France would have to do the same in the rest of the French colonial empire. But losing the empire would not go down well with French public opinion and would lead to the fall of the government. If the government fell, it would harm the US strategic interests in Europe. In particular, the NATO treaty was very close to signing. But if de Gaulle or a left-wing government came back to power, all bets would be off. So the Americans thought, let's not annoy the French here, guys. And when it came to Indochina, Americans liked that there was already a French expeditionary corps on the ground, acting as a big, bad deterrence. So despite all their reservations about quadripartism and Bao Dai's personality, the Americans went for it and backed the French. Fingers crossed, they said, hopefully support for the Viet Minh would decrease whenever France deemed it appropriate to give real and meaningful independence to Bao Dai's government. But as historian Frederick Loggevel said, quote, the obvious questions that followed, what if Bao Dai was not granted such powers? Why should France continue to fight if Vietnam was to be independent? Well, those questions were not discussed, end quote. Even better, those questions were swept under the rug. So this was the end of Ho Chi Minh's old American dream that began, as you will recall, when he tried to get an audience with Woodrow Wilson at Versailles in 1919. Instead of the Americans, he would have to ally with the Chinese and the Soviets. For Mao Zedong, the Vietnamese struggle was first an opportunity to export the Chinese revolution model. But it was also a way of securing China's southern border by making sure that their friends from the DRV prevail. Ho Chi Minh himself had many personal friends among the communist leaders in China. Zhou Enlai, a friend from 1920s in Paris, or Liu Shaoqi, the future president of the Communist Republic of China. Ho Chi Minh had spent a long time in Guangzhou before the war, and he spoke fluent Mandarin. For example, he had translated Mao's writings into French. In short, Ho Chi Minh was a real comrade. In 1949, he had even sent 1,000 men into southern China to help the communists advance. As for Stalin, even though he was not interested in Asia, he felt like he had to stand in solidarity with fellow communists. However, he made it clear that he wanted nothing to do with the day-to-day provision of aid to the DRV. Quote, there must be a division of labor between China and the Soviet Union, end quote. And because the Soviet Union was very busy in Eastern Europe, it was Mao Zedong's job to give Ho Chi Minh what he needed. In January 1950, Ho Chi Minh then made the trip to Moscow. He walked 17 days stopped in Beijing on January 30, 1950, stayed there for a while before arriving in Moscow on February the 10th after a week-long train journey. When he left Moscow, Ho Chi Minh had secured Soviet recognition for the DRV despite Stalin's reservations. And this was massive because Mao and Stalin threw a lifeline to Ho Chi Minh's government. And it is not clear how it would have survived without those recognitions. However, Chinese and Soviet recognition had potential dangerous side effects. One, they would alienate many Vietnamese moderates who were still clinging to the old Viet Minh of 1941, meaning a united front against colonialism. Secondly, the recognitions drastically increased the risk of American direct intervention in the conflict, and that was scary. In early 1950, the DRV was going to face at best the French troops but boosted with American aid, or worse than that, American soldiers in direct confrontation. That said, the DRV also now had the Chinese big brother on its side. The Chinese created a corps of military advisors and set up a military training school to train Viet cadres. Equipment and weapons began pouring very quickly as well into Vietnam, and the beginning of the Korean War in June 1950 further cemented China and Vietnam ties. By August 1950, the entire military cooperation framework was set up. Let us move now on the French side. What was going on? Mao's Chinese successes in 1949 distracted the French command from the progress Vo Nguyen Giap was making himself. Don't get me wrong, the balance of power in Vietnam did not shift. But one, Viet Minh forces were increasingly infiltrating the Red River Delta, and the number of villages under Bao Dai's administration was decreasing steadily. Secondly, the road between Hanoi and Haiphong, that was so vital for the economy, was still under constant attack. In the south, the French were unable to dislodge the guerrillas of Nguyen Binh from their strongholds in the Plain of Reeds and the Camao Peninsula. And when they had the opportunity, the Viet Minh launched sophisticated attacks involving hundreds of fighters. They were even capable of striking at the heart of the French system, as shown by the assassination of the head of the French Sûreté in the middle of Saigon in April 1950. The Chinese threat also masks the evolution of Vo Nguyen Giap's strategy towards a new phase of the war. In November 1949, Giap launched Operation Le Loi, named after the prestigious 15th century ruler who defeated the Chinese. With this operation, Giap took control of a mountainous area west of the Red River Delta. And that allowed the DRV to link its northern base, the Viet Bac, with the one they had in central Vietnam. So without making a big fuss, these guys were putting large swaths of territory under their control. One of the reasons why the French command was distracted was that there were strategic differences at the top. First, between the Commander-in-Chief, General Blaizot, and High Commissioner Pignon. Blaizot wanted to strike again at the Viet Bac, basically to rerun Opération Léa from 1947. But Pignon didn't want any of that. He wanted to focus on, quote-unquote, pacifying southern and central Vietnam. Why? Because he wanted to put more territory under Bao Dai's administration. As a consequence of those disagreements, at the end of 1949, a new general was appointed as Commander-in-Chief, General Carpentier. But that change didn't have any impact on the ground. The main task for the French Expeditionary Corps was to keep a minimum of roads open, even if only during the day. For this purpose, there were strings of military outposts along the main roads in Cochin, China, and in the north, thousands of troops were mobilized to secure the route colonial 3 and the route colonial 4, but the ambushes did not stop, and they became deadlier and deadlier. The combination of the rotten security situation plus the bickering between military and civilian authorities were very alarming to Paris. They were so alarming that the French government decided to send the chief of staff of the army on a fact-finding mission in May 1949. This general's name was Revers, which means setback in French. I mean, you can't make it up. Well, General Setback, or General Revers, conducted a 5-week inspection tour in Vietnam, and his conclusions were sobering. In his report, he said that there was no military solution to the conflict, and he made 3 major recommendations. 1, to give the High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief role to one person. Secondly, Revers recommended to strike a deal with Ho Chi Minh because Bao Dai was hopeless and had no following. And 3, given the lack of manpower and the inevitability of a future Chinese involvement, Revers recommended to evacuate all military outposts along the Chinese border and focused French defenses on the Red River Delta. I mean, Revers was a visionary. He was like a Cassandra. The guy was basically saying, let's cut our losses and find peace with honor with Ho Chi Minh. The Geneva Accord of 1954 could have been signed in mid-1949. But nobody on the French side wanted to hear or talk about the Revers report. Because there was renewed hope after the Élysée Accord that has just been signed. High Commissioner Pignon was still basking in his success, and Bao Dai had just come back to Vietnam. And to describe the effect of the report, I think that I'll read you what Frederick Logval says about it in his masterpiece, Embers of War. Quote, "The Revers report was top secret and was made for the private information of senior French policymakers. It thus caused an uproar when excerpts from it were broadcast on Viet Minh radio, and when, following a fight between a French soldier and a Vietnamese student on a Paris bus, a copy of the report was discovered in the latter's briefcase. The student led French counter-espionage agents to another Vietnamese student's apartment where they found 72 additional copies. Subsequent investigation revealed that the document had circulated widely within the French capital's large Vietnamese community. A major political scandal, the General's Affair, erupted, preoccupying the chattering classes for months and delaying a final decision on Revers' call for an evacuation of the northern forts. The months went by. In late 1949, Giap stepped up the pressure on the convoys along the RC4, and the consolidation of the PLA control in South China increased his determination to subject the French installation to a major assault. He grasped what the new French commander-in-chief, Marcel Carpentier, also grasped, that these posts were forlorn islands in a Viet Minh sea. End quote. So to sum it up, nobody listened to what General Revers had to say. In the meantime, the issues he highlighted did not disappear. Picture this. To welcome the newly appointed French commander, General Carpentier, on the 2nd of October 1949, the Viet Minh set up a giant ambush on the route colonial 4, that the RC4, resulting in 28 French troops killed, 44 missing, and 37 wounded. The new commander, as we have seen, had grasped what General Revers has grasped, that the Chinese border outposts were just not manageable. For the time being, though, he decided not to evacuate them just yet, even though Giap was cranking up the pressure on the French troops. For example, he launched Operation Le Hong Phong I in February 1950 in the northwest and breach French defenses. After that successful probe, and with the Chinese help increasing, Giap was now thinking about a major attack on the isolated French position along the Chinese border. In next episode, let's just say that the conflict is going to move up a gear. We'll talk about the first military turning point of the war, the DRV's victory in the Borders campaign. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you again at the next episode. Until then, be well and goodbye.